Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight we are travelling a very long way indeed, past the coaching inns and powdered wigs, past the market squares of the 1700s, back through the centuries until the roads narrow, the towers grow squat and heavy, and the only lights on the horizon are the small red eyes of cottage fires burning low behind shutters. Tonight we are stepping into the medieval world, into a time of stone churches and open fields, of curfew bells and rush-strewn floors, and we are going looking for someone that history very nearly forgot to write down. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the blanket sit heavy across you. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next few hours. Perhaps there is a lamp still burning softly beside you. Perhaps the room has already gone dark and only the faint glow of the screen remains. Whatever the hour, let the world beyond your walls go quiet for a while. Breathe in slowly. Let it out slower still. And if these journeys into the past help you rest, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy them. And do tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love reading them, scattered across the world like little lights in different windows. Now let the present loosen its grip. Let the centuries fold back, one by one, until the noise of engines becomes the creak of a cart, until the hum of electricity becomes the low murmur of wind moving through thatch. We are somewhere in Europe, in a village whose name may or may not still exist on any modern map. It is evening. The fields are dark and wet. The bell in the church tower has rung the hour, and the sound has gone out across the hedges and the ridges of the ploughland and faded into mist. And in one of these houses, beside a fire that has been carefully banked with ash so a single ember will survive until morning, sits a woman who never married. She is our subject tonight. Not a queen. Not a saint. Though we will meet a few of those along the way. Not a woman remembered for a scandal, or a battle, or a great inheritance. Simply a woman who lived an entire life without ever passing through the door that medieval society treated as the natural doorway of a woman's existence, from her father's household into her husband's. What happened to her? Where did she sleep? What did she eat? And who fed her? And what did the village call her behind her back? These are the questions we are going to sit with tonight, slowly, without hurry. The way you might sit with an old book you have no intention of finishing before sleep. The difficulty, and it is worth saying this at the very beginning, is that the medieval world did not much enjoy writing such women down. The records that survive were made for other purposes entirely. Manor court rolls recorded fines and disputes, and the transfer of strips of land. Tax lists recorded who owed money and roughly how much. Wills recorded what was given and to whom. Coroners' rolls recorded accidents and sudden deaths. A woman drowned fetching water, a woman crushed when a wall gave way. Parish records, where they exist at all this far back, recorded baptisms and burials with the barest scratch of a name. So an unmarried medieval woman tends to appear in the archive the way a bird appears at the edge of a field briefly, without explanation, and then gone. A name in a tax return with no husband beside it. A payment for brewing ale. A fine for taking wood from the Lord's coppice. A bequest of a brass pot and a coverlet to a niece. A complaint that someone struck her, or that she struck someone else. A line in a will that mentions my sister, unmarried, dwelling with me. From such fragments historians have tried to build whole lives, and it must be said that no one can quite agree how much those fragments really tell us. Silence in a document can mean a great many things. It can mean absence. It can also mean that nobody thought the matter worth the ink. Even the words used for her shift and slide beneath our hands. The term we reach for most easily today, spinster, did not begin as an insult, or even as a description of marital status. It described an occupation. A spinster was a woman who spun thread, and in the medieval world that was a very great many women indeed, married and unmarried alike, because before spinning wheels became common the drop spindle went everywhere a woman went. She spun while walking to market. She spun while watching a pot. She spun in the doorway in good light and beside the fire in bad. It took an extraordinary amount of spun thread to keep a single weaver supplied, and so the work was endless and low-paid and almost entirely female. Only later, gradually, did the word slip from the hand that held the spindle to the woman who had no husband, and later still did it acquire the sourness it carries now. Medieval clerks more often reached for other words. Single woman, maiden, damsel, in the higher households. Sometimes simply the woman's name and her father's, long after her father was dead, because a woman without a husband had to be tethered to some man in order to be found again in the records. In some towns she might be described by her trade instead, the brewster, the huckster, the seamster, which is in its way one of the kinder accidents of medieval bureaucracy. It let a woman be defined by what she did, rather than by what she lacked. And what she lacked in the eyes of her neighbours was rarely a small thing. Marriage in the medieval world was not primarily about affection, though affection existed, and can be found glowing quietly in letters and court testimony, and the occasional exasperated poem. Marriage was the machinery by which land moved, by which labour was organised, by which children were legitimated, and holdings kept whole and old age provided for. A married couple was an economic unit. The plough and the hearth needed both. There is an old saying, repeated in various forms across many regions, that a man without a wife was only half a farmer, and the reverse was just as true. A woman alone had to find some other way to make the arithmetic of survival come out even. Yet here is where the picture becomes more interesting than the old stories suggest, because the medieval woman who did not marry was not necessarily left without legal footing. Quite the opposite in some places. Under the customs that developed in England and elsewhere, a married woman largely disappeared into her husband in the eyes of the law. Her goods became his. Her contracts were his to make. She could not, in most circumstances, sue or be sued in her own name. An unmarried woman, a single woman, a femme sole, as the lawyers had it, kept a legal existence of her own. She could hold land. She could make a will. She could sue a neighbour who owed her money and be sued in return. She could take an apprentice in some towns. She could enter a contract and be held to it. This was not freedom in any sense we would recognise. Poverty could close every door that the law left open. Custom, kin, and the sharp attention of neighbours could narrow her choices until the legal capacity was almost theoretical. But it was not nothing. In a world where most women's legal personhood was folded into a husband's, the unmarried woman kept hold of a thin, cold, useful thing, her own name on a document. Why then did some women never marry at all? The answers are as varied as the women themselves, and historians have argued about the proportions for a very long time without arriving anywhere restful. Some never married because there was nobody to marry. War, disease, dangerous work and migration could hollow out the young men of a district in a single generation. Some never married because there was no dowry, no chest of linen, no cow, no coins set aside. And in a marriage market where a woman's portion mattered enormously, a girl without one might wait. And wait. Until waiting became a permanent condition. Some stayed at home because a parent grew sick and needed nursing, and by the time the nursing ended, so had the years in which a proposal was expected. And some, we can say with reasonable confidence, chose it. Not always loudly, and not always in ways that left a trace, but they chose it. There were women who entered convents with genuine devotion. There were women in the Low Countries and the Rhineland who joined the Beguines, communities of pious laywomen who lived together, worked, prayed, and took no permanent vows, and who puzzled and occasionally alarmed the church precisely because they refused to fit into either of the two categories on offer. There were town women who kept shops and brewhouses and seam, from the shape of their affairs to have had no interest whatsoever in handing the whole enterprise to a husband. What proportion of unmarried women chose their state, and what proportion had it chosen for them, is a question that cannot be answered from the surviving evidence, and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing with confidence. There is one great argument that runs beneath all of this, and it deserves a mention before we go further, though I promise not to let it disturb your rest. Some historians have argued that across much of northwestern Europe a distinctive pattern took hold in the later medieval centuries, that women married comparatively late, in their 20s rather than their teens, and that a significant share never married at all. Others have pushed back hard, pointing out that the evidence is patchy, that regions differed enormously, that a bad harvest or a plague year could reshape a village's marriage patterns for decades. What almost everyone agrees on is that after the great mortality of the 14th century, when so many died so quickly, wages rose, labour became scarce, and young women could suddenly earn in ways that had not been possible before. A girl with wages in her hand had, for a little while at least, a slightly different set of choices than her grandmother had known. So hold this in mind as the fire settles and the room grows warm around you. There was no single unmarried woman in the Middle Ages. There was the merchant's daughter with silver spoons and a bed with hangings. There was the servant sleeping on a pallet by the kitchen fire in a house not her own. There was the anchoress walled into a cell beside the church, receiving food through a curtained window. There was the alewife with her ale stake set out above the door. There was the old woman at the edge of the village who knew which herbs to gather in the spring, and whom the neighbours came to when a child would not stop coughing, and whom those same neighbours eyed uneasily when the cows sickened. They shared no destiny. What they shared was the necessity of building a life alongside an institution that everyone around them treated as the natural and complete shape of a woman's existence. And their traces are still there, if you look gently. A worn key, a brass pot named in a will, initials stitched into a strip of linen, a name in a court roll, fine twopence for brewing against the assize, and then never mentioned again. Outside, the wind moves across the ploughland. The bell in the tower is silent now until morning, and somewhere behind a wooden door, a woman who never married lays another turf on the fire, checks the latch, and settles into the dark. Every life begins somewhere small, and hers began in a room that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, in a house whose floor was beaten earth strewn with rushes, or perhaps in a stone chamber with a shuttered window looking out over a walled garden. The two beginnings were worlds apart, and yet in one respect they were the same. From the moment a girl could stand, the household around her began, without ceremony and often without unkindness, to prepare her for a future that would be arranged largely by other people. In a peasant household, that preparation began with small jobs given to small hands. She scared crows from the sown field with a rattle or a handful of stones. She drove the geese down to the pond and back again. She gathered kindling along the hedgerows, carrying it home in a bundle strapped across her back, and learned early which wood burned hot and which merely smoked and spat. She carried water, first in a little pot and later in the full pail, and the path from the well or the stream to the door became so familiar that she could walk it in the dark without stumbling. Coroner's records, those grim, oddly tender documents that recorded sudden death in painstaking detail, are full of children who came to grief at exactly these tasks. A child who fell into the well, a child scalded by a pot pulled from the fire, a child drowned in a ditch while fetching water. Read enough of them, and a picture emerges of a childhood that was affectionate, certainly, but almost never idle, and rarely fenced off from danger. By 7 or 8 she would be learning the deeper skills: how to milk without startling the cow, how to skim cream and work butter until the water ran clear, how to salt and dry and store, because the whole rhythm of the year bent toward the question of whether the household would have enough to eat in February. She learned to spin, of course. She began learning to spin almost as soon as her fingers could manage the twist, and she would go on spinning for the rest of her life. She learned to judge when bread was proved, when ale had worked, when the pottage needed more water, and when it needed more fire. Above all, she learned by watching. Medieval instruction was rarely formal in a peasant household. It was repetition, correction, and the sharp word of a mother who had 100 things to do and no patience for a spoiled batch. A dropped pitcher mattered. a scorched loaf mattered. These were not the failures of a clumsy child, but the loss of real substance from a household that had very little margin. In wealthier homes, the shape of the training changed, but the underlying purpose did not. A gentlewoman's daughter or a merchant's daughter might learn her letters, at least enough to read a psalter and follow the words of the Mass. She learned needlework of a finer kind, embroidery and coloured silks and sometimes gold thread, work that was both an accomplishment and a genuine economic asset, since fine textiles were among the most valuable things a household could own. She learned to carve at table, to pour, to greet a guest, to walk into a room and out of it correctly, because manners in the medieval upper household were not decoration but a kind of language, and a girl who could not speak it fluently would be marked out immediately. And she learned management. This is the part that later ages have most consistently underestimated. Running a large medieval household was an administrative undertaking of real complexity. There were stores to be counted, servants to be directed, provisions to be bought at the right season and at the right price, accounts to be checked against the reckonings of a bailiff or a steward who might or might not be honest. A woman of standing was expected to be able to take the whole apparatus in hand when her husband was away at war, at court or at law, which, given how much of a medieval nobleman's life was spent away at one of those three things, was often. Advice literature written for such women survives, and it is strikingly practical. Know your income, know your outgoings, inspect the accounts yourself. Do not let the servants tell you what the granary holds when you can go and look. The daughter absorbed all of this, whether or not anyone sat her down to explain it. And she absorbed something else too, more quietly, from overheard conversation and visiting relatives and the arrival of a lawyer with a roll of parchment, that her marriage was a matter of negotiation, and that the negotiation would be conducted by other people about her, in rooms she was not invited to enter. The central object in that negotiation was her portion. Call it dowry, marriage portion, maritagium. The terminology varied, and the lawyers cared about the differences a great deal more than we need to tonight. What mattered was that when a woman married, wealth moved with her. Among the peasantry this might be a cow, a brass pot, a chest, a mattress, a few coins painfully accumulated, sometimes a strip or two of land. Among the gentry and nobility it might be a substantial sum of money, or an estate. In return, the groom's family was often expected to settle something on the bride to support her if she outlived him. A dower, a jointure, a named portion of the land whose income would be hers in widowhood. This was, in effect, an insurance policy written in land. And because it was so consequential, families haggled over it with a coldness that can be startling to read. Letters survive from later medieval England in which parents discuss a daughter's marriage almost entirely in terms of sums, acreage, and the reliability of the other family's promises. Affection appears, sometimes very movingly, but it appears alongside the arithmetic, not instead of it. Here is where a great many unmarried lives quietly began, not with a refusal or a broken heart, but with a shortage. A family with several daughters had to find several portions, and portions did not multiply. A bad harvest could consume the money set aside. A father's death could throw everything into the hands of an heir with different priorities. A lawsuit could swallow the estate, and in a marriage market where a woman's portion largely determined how many suitors she attracted, the daughter without one might simply never receive a serious offer. She did not decide not to marry. The decision was made for her by a series of small economic events, none of which had anything to do with her at all. There is a related and rather poignant pattern visible in some noble and gentry families, where portions were concentrated on one or two daughters to make advantageous matches, and the remaining daughters were directed toward religion instead. A convent in many regions also required a payment on entry, but it could be considerably less than a marriage portion of equivalent social standing. This has led some historians to describe convents rather harshly as dumping grounds for surplus daughters, and there is truth in it. But it is not the whole truth, and we will come back to that, because a good many women found in the cloister exactly the life they wanted, and some fought very hard to get there. For the great majority of girls, however, The years between childhood and marriage were spent in a way that has become one of the most important discoveries in the study of medieval women's lives. They went away to work. The practice is usually called life cycle service, and once you know to look for it, you find it everywhere in late medieval northwestern Europe. A young person, girl or boy, though we are following the girls tonight, would leave home in their early or middle teens and enter another household as a servant. Not a servant in the later sense of a permanent occupational class, but a servant for a season of life. They were hired by the year, usually at a hiring fair or by private agreement, for board, lodging, clothing, and a wage. They lived in the master's house, ate at his table or near it, and were subject to his authority almost as a child of the family. And then, after a year, they might stay or move on to another place, and another, accumulating skills and coins for perhaps a decade. The purpose of this, for most of them, was to accumulate the very thing their parents could not always provide, a portion. A girl entered service at 14 with nothing, and if she was careful, if she was lucky, if she was not defrauded of her wages or dismissed after an accusation or laid low by illness, she might emerge at 24 with enough saved to furnish a household and marry. It is difficult to overstate how much this changed things. It meant that a great many women spent their entire youth working for wages, away from their parents, in towns and villages not their own. It meant they made their own friendships, chose their own churches, and in many cases chose their own husbands, since the further a young woman was from her father's supervision, the more her marriage became a matter of her own consent. Church law, it should be said, had already established something remarkable in principle. A marriage was made by the free consent of the two parties, and a marriage contracted without consent could be challenged. Church courts heard such cases regularly. Whether a frightened 17-year-old could realistically invoke that principle against a determined family is another matter entirely. And no one can quite agree how often it happened in practice. But the principle existed, and it was not decorative. Cases survive in which young people successfully insisted on partners their families had not chosen. And it meant something else, which brings us back to our subject. If marriage depended on saving up, then every year of delay was a year in which something might go wrong. The savings might be spent on a sick parent, the intended husband might die, and death came often and without warning, in a bad winter, in a fever season, in a fall from a roof, in an accident with a cart. A woman might reach 30 with a small hoard of coins and no one left to marry, or she might simply find, without ever quite deciding it, that the life she had built as a servant in a good household was steadier than the life a marriage would offer her, and that she preferred to keep it. We can see the shape of these decisions in wills, which are among the most humane documents the Middle Ages have left us. A woman leaves her best gown to one niece and her second best to another. She leaves a brass pot to the girl who served alongside her. She leaves a few pence to the parish church for candles, and a few more for prayers for her soul, and a little to a poor neighbour. There is no husband in the document and no children. There is instead a network: sisters, nieces, godchildren, fellow servants, a woman named simply as a friend, and the careful, deliberate distribution of a life's accumulated goods among them. That is not the record of an empty life. It is the record of a life whose relationships did not happen to take the shape the law had a word for. And so the girl by the fire grows older. Her hands roughen. The path to the well grows familiar and then worn. One year she packs a bundle and walks to a hiring fair, and stands there among the other young people while a farmer looks her over and asks what she can do. She says she can milk and brew and spin and bake and mind children. He offers her a wage for the year, and she takes it, and she goes to live in a house she has never entered before. Outside, the light is going, the bell rings across the fields, and somewhere on a road between two villages, a girl with everything she owns tied in a cloth is walking toward the rest of her life, without the faintest idea what shape it will take. The house she walked into was not her own, and it never would be. That was the first thing a young servant learned, and she learned it in the small ways rather than the large ones. In where she was told to sleep, in which bench she took at table, in the tone of voice used when she was called. Yet for perhaps a third of the young people in a late medieval town or village, this was simply what one's 20s looked like. Service was not a fall from grace. It was a stage, expected and ordinary, and most people passed through it. Let us follow her inside, because the interior of a medieval household is where a great deal of our story takes place, and it is a good deal more interesting than the bare stone rooms that survive today might suggest. She woke early, in the dark, in a country where the dark lasted a very long time indeed for half the year. There were no clocks in most houses. There was the light, the bell, the cock, and the habits of the body. In winter she rose before the sun and worked by firelight and by the thin flame of a rushlight, a peeled rush soaked in melted fat, set at an angle in a little iron holder, burning perhaps a quarter of an hour before it needed replacing. Candles of tallow existed and were used, but they cost money and smoked and smelled of the mutton fat they were rendered from. Beeswax burned clean and sweet, and was largely for churches and for the tables of the rich. The quality of a household's light was one of the truest indicators of its wealth, and a girl who had grown up by rushlight and then entered a great house would have noticed the difference at once. Not the tapestries, not the silver, but the astonishing extravagance of a room properly lit after dark. Her first task was almost always the fire. A medieval fire was rarely extinguished. It was banked. The last person awake covered the embers with ash so that a core of heat survived the night, and the first person awake raked it open, fed it with dry kindling, and coaxed it back. There was a curfew bell in many towns for exactly this reason, a signal to cover the fire and reduce the risk of the thing that everyone feared above almost all else, a night fire in a street of timber and thatch. If the embers had died, she would take a small covered pot or a shovel and go to a neighbour's door to beg a coal. This was a commonplace errand, and it was also one of the 1,000 small threads by which households were bound to one another. You did not refuse a neighbour fire. You might dislike her, gossip about her, take her to the manor court over a strayed pig, but you gave her fire, because next winter it might be your hearth that had gone cold. Then water. Then the animals, if there were animals, which in a village house there nearly always were, and which frequently lived under the same roof at the lower end of the building, separated by no more than a passage. The heat of a cow is not nothing on a January morning, and neither is the smell, and medieval people were accustomed to both. Then the day's real work began, and the shape of it depended entirely on what kind of household she had entered. In a peasant farmstead she milked, churned, made cheese, fed poultry, weeded the croft, helped with the harvest, brewed, baked, spun, and did whatever else the season demanded. Dairying in particular was so thoroughly women's work that in some regions the dairy itself was spoken of as a female domain into which men rarely stepped. It was skilled work and unforgiving. Butter would not come if the cream was too warm or too cold, cheese would spoil if the vessels were not scrupulously clean, and since nobody understood why, the failures were mysterious and unnerving. When a churn refused to yield butter after an hour of hard labour, the explanation reached for was sometimes practical and sometimes not. A piece of iron might be dropped into the churn, a charm might be said over it, hot water might be poured across the lid. Whether the woman doing it believed she was defeating a malicious neighbour's ill-wishing, or simply doing what her mother had always done, is precisely the sort of question the records cannot answer, and historians have argued over it for a long time. In a town household the work looked different. There she might serve a craftsman and his wife, and find herself drawn into the trade itself, carrying, fetching, minding the shop front, learning the rudiments of a craft she would never be formally admitted to. Towns had guilds, and guilds were generally, though not universally, hostile to women's full membership, but the boundary was leakier in practice than in statute. Widows continued their husbands' workshops in a great many trades. Daughters and servants learned by proximity, and certain trades were so overwhelmingly female that no guild bothered to keep women out of them, because no man wanted in silkwork in some cities, spinning almost everywhere, the endless intermediate labour of the textile industry that made the visible male craftsman possible. In a great house, the household of a lord, a bishop, a wealthy knight, she entered something closer to an institution. Such households could number dozens or even hundreds of people, mostly male, organised into departments with an intricate hierarchy: the hall, the kitchen, the buttery, the pantry, the stable, the chapel. Women were a minority in these establishments, but they were there, chiefly in the personal service of the lady of the house and in the laundry, which was almost invariably female work, and almost invariably done by women who lived outside the household proper because of the nature of the labour and the constant contact with water and lye. Laundry deserves a moment, because it was brutal. Linen was soaked, beaten, boiled with lye made from wood ash, rinsed repeatedly, and then spread on grass or hedges to bleach in whatever sun was available. Lye burned the hands. Wet linen is astonishingly heavy. In winter, water numbed the fingers to uselessness and cloth froze stiff. The laundress was among the lowest paid and hardest worked figures in the household economy, and she was also. In the moralising literature of the period, persistently and unfairly associated with sexual availability, a slander that tells us more about the men writing the literature than about the women scrubbing the sheets. Wherever she served, our young woman's day ended with the fire again, banked and covered and with sleep. And where she slept mattered. In a peasant house she might sleep in the single main room with everyone else, on a straw mattress, or in a loft under the thatch reached by a ladder. In a town house she might share a bed with another servant. Sharing beds was entirely ordinary and carried no significance whatever. Beds were expensive, and warmth was scarce. In a great house she might sleep in a chamber with the other women of the household, or on a pallet outside her mistress's door. Privacy, in the sense we mean it, barely existed. This is one of the genuinely hard things for a modern listener to feel their way into. The medieval world was not private. People slept together, ate together, worked within sight of one another, and lived in villages where the failure to attend Mass would be noticed by everyone. The idea of a room of one's own would have struck most people as either impossibly luxurious or faintly suspicious. Solitude was for hermits, anchoresses, and the very rich, and that constant visibility bore down with particular weight on a young unmarried woman, because her reputation was an asset that could be destroyed without her doing anything at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A medieval woman's marriageability, her employability, and to a considerable extent her physical safety depended on what her neighbours said about her. And the mechanism by which they said it was gossip, an activity so socially important that the church legislated about it, that manor courts fined people for it, and that ecclesiastical courts spent an enormous proportion of their time adjudicating cases of defamation brought by women whose good name had been attacked. Defamation suits are, in fact, one of the richest sources we have for women's lives, precisely because women went to court in large numbers to defend their reputations. That tells us two things at once: that the damage was real and worth the cost of litigation, and that women were not passive in the face of it. The accusations that mattered most were sexual. To be called a whore in a medieval village was not a passing rudeness. It was an attack on the woman's ability to marry, on her family's standing, and on her credibility as a witness in any future dispute. And it was very hard to disprove. The church courts also prosecuted actual sexual offences with some vigour, and the records show a striking pattern. Women bore the visible consequences, and men frequently did not. A pregnancy could not be hidden. A man's involvement could. Yet here again the picture resists simplification. Premarital sex was extremely common and, in many communities, tacitly accepted where a promise of marriage had been made, and in church law, a promise of marriage followed by consummation could actually constitute a valid marriage. This produced an enormous volume of litigation, some of it heartbreaking, in which a woman came before the court insisting that words had been exchanged in a garden or a barn or beside a well, and that those words had made them man and wife, and a man insisted that they had not. Witnesses were called. Neighbours testified about what they had seen and heard, and the court had to determine, on the basis of remembered conversation, whether a marriage existed. Some of those cases ended with the marriage upheld. Some ended with the woman left with nothing but a ruined name and sometimes a child. And some of those women never married at all afterwards, not because they had chosen a single life, but because the community had quietly decided the question for them. So we begin to see the paths multiplying. There is the woman who never accumulated a portion. There is the woman whose intended died. There is the woman whose reputation was destroyed by a rumour that may or may not have had any foundation. There is the woman who kept moving from service to service until service simply became her life. There is the woman who chose the cloister, and the woman who was placed there. And there is one more figure we should meet before this section closes, because she stands at the far edge of the spectrum, and she is one of the most extraordinary things the medieval world produced. The woman who chose enclosure not as a retreat from failure, but as a vocation of the most deliberate kind. The anchoress was a woman who had herself sealed into a small cell attached to the wall of a church, often with a service of enclosure that resembled a funeral, and who did not come out again. She had a window into the church through which she could see the altar. She had a window to the outside world, curtained, through which food was passed and through which. This is the part that surprises people. She frequently gave counsel to a stream of visitors seeking advice. A guide written for such women survives in several versions and is full of practical instruction. How to manage a servant, how to deal with visitors, how to guard against the particular temptations of a life spent alone in one room. She was, in the strictest sense, the most confined woman in medieval society. She was also, in a way that is genuinely difficult to reconcile, one of the freest. She owed obedience to no husband. She managed her own hours. She read, prayed, thought, and in a small number of remarkable cases wrote. And what she wrote could travel far beyond her cell. Outside, the wind picks up across the fields. The bell has rung for curfew. In one house a girl covers the fire with ash, and in another a woman kneels at a squint window watching a lamp burn beside an altar, and neither of them expects to be remembered. Let us stay with the woman at the squint window a little longer, because the religious life is where the medieval world came closest to admitting, openly and without embarrassment, that a woman might live an entire life without a husband, and be honoured rather than pitied for it. That admission came with conditions, of course. It always did, but it was real, and for a great many women it was the difference between a life with a shape and a life without one. The convent stood at the centre of that world, and the first thing to say about the medieval convent is that it was not one thing. It could be a great abbey with lands across 3 counties, whose abbess held a manorial court, appointed priests to parishes, collected rents, and dealt with kings and bishops as a landholder among landholders. It could be a modest priory of a dozen women scraping by on a small endowment, perpetually in debt, its roof leaking, its bishop writing sharp letters about the state of the buildings. It could be a house of extraordinary austerity, where the rule was kept to the letter, or a comfortable establishment where the sisters kept small dogs, wore rather finer linen than the rule allowed, and received visitors more often than the visiting bishop thought proper. Episcopal visitation records are a delight for exactly this reason. A bishop or his deputy arrived, questioned each nun separately, and wrote down the complaints. And the complaints are wonderfully, reassuringly human. The prioress does not render accounts. The food is bad. So-and-so keeps a monkey. The dormitory roof lets in the rain. There are too many visitors. There are not enough candles. One sister has been keeping the keys and will not give them up. The gate is left unlocked. Somebody has been singing in a manner that is not devout. These are not the records of a monolithic institution of silent obedience. They are the records of a community, a group of women living together for decades, with all the affection, friction, boredom, loyalty, and grievance that decades of shared life produce anywhere. How did a woman get there? Sometimes by conviction, sometimes by family arrangement, occasionally at an age young enough that we would not call it a choice at all, though the church required a woman to be old enough to consent freely before making final profession, and cases exist of young women who reached that age and walked out. sometimes by widowhood, entering later in life with a settled income, and frequently by a combination of piety and economics that neither the woman nor her family would have thought it necessary to disentangle. The entry payment mattered. Strictly speaking, the Church condemned the sale of religious office and forbade demanding payment for admission. But in practice, a family was expected to provide something: an endowment, a rent, a gift of land, a contribution toward the maintenance of the house. And so the convent, like the marriage market, sorted women by wealth. The great houses filled with the daughters of the nobility and the gentry. Poorer women entered as lay sisters, taking on the heavy domestic labour, the kitchen, the laundry, the brewhouse, the garden, while the choir sisters gave more of their hours to the office. The office was the spine of everything. The day was divided by prayer at fixed hours, from the small hours of the night through to the last office before sleep, and the bell that summoned each hour governed the community's life absolutely. A woman who entered a convent at 18 and died at 70 had risen in the dark to sing psalms perhaps 20,000 times. That kind of repetition does something to a person. It is not a life most of us can easily imagine from the inside, but the surviving writings of religious women suggest that for some it produced a depth of interior experience that they struggled, and sometimes magnificently succeeded, to put into words. Between the offices came work, and the work was various. There were gardens to tend and infirmaries to run. There were books to copy and, in some houses, to illuminate. There were girls to educate. Convents took in the daughters of local families as boarders and pupils, which made them, among other things, some of the most important centres of female education in Europe. There was correspondence. There was, in the wealthier houses, estate management of real complexity. And an abbess who could not read an account roll was an abbess in trouble, and there was authority. This is the point that deserves emphasis, because it is easily lost. A medieval abbess exercised genuine formal public power. She governed a community, she controlled property, she made appointments, she was answerable to a bishop and ultimately to Rome, but within her own house she ruled. There were very few other positions in medieval society, perhaps none outside the highest ranks of the nobility, in which a woman held command over an institution in her own name and not as a substitute for an absent man. For a woman with a mind and a capacity for administration, born into a world with almost no other outlet for either, the cloister was not a consolation prize, but it was not the only religious option, and the alternatives are in some ways more surprising. In the towns of the Low Countries and along the Rhine, from the 13th century onward, women began to gather into communities that fitted no existing category. They were called beguines. They lived together, or sometimes in adjacent houses arranged around a courtyard with a chapel, forming what amounted to a small walled neighbourhood of women. They prayed, they worked, spinning, weaving, nursing, teaching, caring for the dying. They took no permanent vows. They kept their own property. And crucially, they could leave. A beguine who wished to marry could walk out of the community and marry, and this was understood and permitted. That single fact made them profoundly difficult for the institutional church to categorise. They were not nuns. They were not laywomen in the ordinary sense. They were pious, self-governing, largely self-supporting communities of unmarried women living in the middle of busy commercial cities without male oversight of the usual kind. Some churchmen admired them enormously. Others found them alarming, suspected them of unauthorised preaching, or of theological error, and pressed for their suppression. Church councils legislated about them. Some communities were investigated, some were dissolved, and at least one Beguine writer was condemned and executed for a book that was judged heretical. And yet the movement persisted for centuries, and beguinages continued to shelter women long after the medieval period ended. What drew women to them? Some of it was doubtless spiritual. This was an era of intense lay religious feeling, of movements demanding a more direct and personal devotion. But some of it was practical in a way that speaks directly to our subject tonight. In prosperous cloth-producing cities there were a great many women and comparatively fewer opportunities to marry well. A beginnage offered a respectable place to live, work and grow old, without a husband and without the full renunciation of the cloister. It offered safety in numbers, it offered company, and it offered a socially legible answer to the question that followed every unmarried woman about, what are you then, if you are not a wife? There were other answers too, less formal. Some pious women simply lived at home in a quasi-religious way, taking private vows of chastity, wearing plain dress, attending mass daily, giving what they could to the poor. Vowesses in England were women, usually widows, sometimes never married, who made a formal public vow of chastity before a bishop and thereafter lived in the world under that protection. And it was a protection. A vowess had a recognised status, a defence against pressure to remarry, and a claim on a certain respect that an ordinary single woman could not command. Then there were the hospitals, which in the medieval sense were rarely hospitals as we mean the word. They were houses of hospitality, for the sick, certainly, but also for the aged, the poor, travellers, pilgrims, foundlings and the dying. Many were run by religious communities, and many depended overwhelmingly on the labour of women, nursing sisters who washed bodies, changed linen, made broth, sat through the nights, and prepared the dead for burial. It was work performed at the very boundary of life and death, in rooms thick with the smell of vinegar and burnt herbs and sickness, by women who had no medical training in any formal sense, but who had seen a very great deal. And here, of course, we arrive at leprosy, and at the leper houses that stood outside so many medieval towns, and at the women who staffed them. The medieval understanding of the disease was tangled up with theology in ways that are painful to read about, but the practical response often included care as well as exclusion, and that care was frequently female and frequently unmarried. Let us not romanticize any of this. The religious life could be a prison. Girls were placed in convents who did not want to be there and had no realistic way out. Convents could be poor, cold, hungry, and quarrelsome. The rule could be enforced by a superior who was cruel, or ignored by one who was negligent. Visitation records show us women who complained that the prioress had struck them, that food was withheld, that the accounts were being plundered. There were women in these houses who spent 40 years in a life they had never chosen. And yet, alongside them, there were women who had chosen it fiercely, against family opposition, and who found in it the only kind of life they wanted. Both were true, in the same building, at the same time. There is one thing more the religious life offered, and it is the thing that has allowed a handful of these women to reach us directly, in their own voices, across 700 or 800 years. It offered them literacy, leisure of a certain kind, and a subject matter that gave a woman permission to speak. A medieval woman who wished to be heard on politics or law or philosophy faced a wall, but a woman who reported what God had shown her occupied different ground. Visionary experience was, by definition, unmediated. It bypassed the schools and the universities from which women were excluded. It could not be dismissed on the grounds that she had not studied, because study had nothing to do with it. This created a genuine and dangerous opening. Dangerous, because a visionary who strayed too far could be condemned. The boundary between a saint and a heretic could be drawn very finely and by men with their own reasons, but real. And through that opening came some of the most remarkable writing of the medieval period, works of theology, of natural philosophy, of medicine, of music, of ferocious political correspondence, in which women who held no office whatsoever wrote to popes and princes and told them plainly where they had gone wrong. Not all of these women were unmarried, and not all were nuns, but an extraordinary proportion of the women whose words survived from the Middle Ages lived outside marriage in one form or another, in a cloister, in a cell, in a beginnage, in a vowed and single life in the world. The correlation is not an accident. Marriage, for most women, consumed everything: the pregnancies, the children, the household, the labour, the years. A woman outside it had, at least sometimes, hours that belonged to her. The bell rings for the night office. Somewhere a door is unbolted, and a line of women in dark habits move through a cold cloister toward a lamplit choir, their breath visible, their feet finding the worn places on the stone by memory alone. But most unmarried women were not in cloisters. Most were in the world, in the crowded, muddy, noisy, opportunity-scattered world of the medieval town, where the bells rang for markets as much as for prayer, and where a woman with a skill and a small stock of goods could sometimes make a living entirely in her own name. The medieval town has a reputation for being small, and by our standards nearly all of them were. But we should not let that flatten them. A town of 5,000 people was a dense, complicated organism, streets of overhanging timber houses with shops open to the street at ground level, workshops behind, chambers above, a marketplace, a river or a quay, churches thick on the ground, walls with gates that closed at dusk. Everything happened in public. The shoemaker worked where you could watch him, the butcher killed where you could smell it, and the women of the town moved through all of it, carrying, selling, buying, arguing, and being noticed. Towns drew unmarried women in extraordinary numbers. This is one of the most reliable patterns in the demographic evidence. Medieval towns tended to have more women than men, and a substantial proportion of those women were unmarried. They came from the countryside seeking work and wages. They came because the alternative, remaining as a surplus daughter in a household with no land to spare, offered nothing. They came because towns had need of exactly the kinds of labour that women could supply, and a great deal of that labour was in the business of feeding and clothing people. Consider ale. Medieval people drank ale in quantities that alarm modern readers, and they did so for entirely sensible reasons. It was nourishing, it was made from grain, and it was safer than much of the available water. But ale did not keep. Without hops it soured within days, which meant it had to be brewed constantly, locally, in small batches, in ordinary houses, using ordinary domestic equipment, a vessel, a fire, water, grain, and knowledge. This made brewing, for a long period, overwhelmingly women's work. The word brewster meant a female brewer, and the alewife was a stock figure in medieval life, precisely because she was everywhere. A woman brewed for her household, brewed a little extra, and sold the surplus to neighbours. She announced that ale was ready by putting out an ale stake, a pole with a bush or garland fixed to the end, above her door. Neighbours came with jugs. Money changed hands. It was casual, intermittent, and for a great many women it was the single most accessible way of earning cash. It was also regulated to an almost comic degree. Towns and manors enforced an assize of ale, setting prices and standards, and appointed officials, ale tasters, to check that the stuff was of proper strength and sold in proper measure. The manorial court rolls that record the resulting fines are one of our richest sources for women's economic activity, because they list, season after season, the names of the women who brewed and sold. And the fines were frequently so routine, so regular, and so modest that historians have concluded they functioned less as punishment than as a kind of license fee, the cost of doing business, paid twice a year forever. Read those rolls and you find unmarried women scattered all through them, selling ale against the assize, selling in unsealed measures, selling at too high a price. Find twopence, find a penny, find again the following year. It is not a glamorous archive, but it is an archive of women making money. Later in the medieval period this changed, and the change matters. As hopped beer spread, brewing became something you could do at a larger scale, for a wider market, with capital investment in bigger vessels and longer storage. And as it scaled up, it moved out of the domestic sphere and into the hands of men and of organised trade companies. Women were gradually squeezed toward the margins of an industry they had largely built. The alewife did not vanish, but she was diminished, and the figure of the fraudulent, grotesque alewife who cheats her customers became a favourite subject of moralising verse and church wall painting, which is generally a sign that a group of women is being pushed out of a trade rather than welcomed in it. The same pattern, in different clothes, appears elsewhere. Textiles were the great industry of the medieval economy, and the preparation of thread was so labour-intensive that it required an army. Sorting, washing, carding, combing, spinning — this was the foundation on which every weaver, fuller, dyer and merchant stood, and it was almost entirely female. Spinning in particular could be done by anyone, anywhere, in any spare moment, which made it the natural fallback for every woman who needed a few pence. It was also paid abominably, precisely because everyone could do it. A woman who spun for a living spun constantly, in poor light, for very little, and she would go on doing so until her eyes gave out. But textiles offered other footholds too. Silk work in some cities was a genuinely female trade with skilled practitioners, apprentices and workshops run by women. Embroidery of the highest quality, the vestments and hangings that were among the most valuable movable goods in Europe, was in some places a recognised craft with women among its masters, and the making and selling of small clothing goods, caps, purses, gloves, laces, was a persistent female niche. Then there was the food trade, and here we meet a word worth knowing: huckster. A huckster was a small-scale retailer who bought goods and resold them in tiny quantities: fish, poultry, eggs, butter, cheese, bread, vegetables, ale. Hucksters were despised by the authorities, who regarded them as parasites inflating prices, and they were fined and regulated constantly. They were also indispensable, because most townspeople bought their food in small amounts daily and had no means of buying wholesale. And hucksters were, again and again, women, often poor women, often unmarried, often working with a basket and a few pennies of stock. To be a huckster was to live at the bottom edge of the market economy. Your capital was tiny. A single bad day, a spoiled batch of fish, a confiscated stock, an illness that kept you from the street could wipe you out, and yet it required nothing but the goods themselves and the nerve to stand in a crowded place and sell. Above the hucksters stood women of more substance. There were unmarried women who kept shops, held stock, extended credit, and appear in the records as creditors and litigants in their own right. In some English towns a woman could formally register as a femme sole trader, which meant that she conducted business independently and bore the legal consequences independently, a status designed chiefly for married women whose husbands wished to be insulated from their debts, but which reflects a broader reality. Towns needed women's trade and made room for it when it suited them. Credit is worth pausing on because it was the circulatory system of the medieval economy, and because it drew unmarried women deep into the legal life of their communities. Almost nobody paid cash for everything. Goods were supplied on trust and settled later, at harvest, at a fair, at a quarter day. Debts were remembered, chased, forgiven, litigated, and so town and manor courts are full of women suing for debts owed to them and being sued for debts they owed. A woman who lent, sold on credit, or stood surety was participating in a network of obligation that made her legally visible in a way that a married woman largely could not be. She appears therefore in the record as a person with a name, an occupation and a claim, and she appears too in the less comfortable records. Towns were dangerous, and a woman without a household behind her was more exposed than most. Court records show women assaulted, robbed, cheated of wages, defrauded of goods. They show servants dismissed without payment and going to law about it. They show, unmistakably, that some women were driven into prostitution by exactly the economic precariousness we have been describing, and that medieval authorities responded with a tangle of policies that ranged from licensed and regulated districts in some cities to periodic expulsions and punishments in others. It is a bleak part of the story and it should not be smoothed over. The same conditions that allowed a woman to trade independently could, with a turn of luck, leave her with nothing to sell but herself. Between those extremes lay the mass of ordinary working women, and their lives were built out of what historians sometimes call an economy of makeshifts. She did not have a job. She had 5 or 6. She spun in the winter, She helped with the harvest in August. She brewed when she had grain. She nursed a sick neighbour for a fee. She took in mending. She minded children. She gleaned. She kept hens and sold the eggs. She hired herself out by the day for weeding or haymaking or carrying. None of these things was a living. Together, in a good year, they were. This is why unmarried women are so hard to find in the records, and why they are so easy to underestimate when found. A man might be described as a weaver for 40 years. A woman might be described as a spinster in one document, a Brewster in another, a servant in a third, and by her father's name in a fourth, and it is the same woman. Her working life was a mosaic, and the archive only ever shows us single tiles. There is a season to it too, and the seasons governed everything. In spring she planted the croft, onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, the herbs that were both flavour and medicine. In early summer came the weeding and haymaking, which drew everyone into the fields. Late summer was harvest, the great labour of the year, when every hand was hired and wages briefly rose and even the poorest could earn. Autumn was gleaning, gathering the grain left behind after the reapers, a customary rite that mattered enormously to poor women and that landholders periodically tried to restrict, producing disputes that show us just how thin the margin of survival could be. Autumn was also slaughtering and salting and drying and the laying in of fuel. And then winter, when the world contracted toward the hearth, and the work turned inward, spinning, mending, carding, the endless indoor tasks that could be done in a dim room by a small fire. Winter was when reserves were eaten. Winter was when the old and the frail died. Winter was long. As the light goes from a town street, the shutters come down over the shop fronts one by one. A woman with an empty basket walks home along a lane where the mud has frozen into ridges. Somewhere a gate is being closed and barred for the night. Above her, in a window, a rushlight flickers and steadies, and a woman who has been spinning since before dawn winds the last of the thread and lays the spindle down. The spindle is laid down. The fire is banked. And now the question that follows every unmarried woman through every century of this story presses in again, quietly, the way it always did. Where exactly does she sleep? Because a medieval life was organised around the household, and a household was a legal and economic thing as much as a physical one. It had a head. It had members. It appeared in tax lists and in the reckonings of manorial officials as a unit. And a woman who belonged to no household, who was nobody's wife, nobody's daughter still at home, nobody's servant under indenture, was a person the system had genuine difficulty accommodating. So most unmarried women lived within somebody's household, and the terms on which they did so shaped everything about their lives. The commonest arrangement, and the one that appears most often in wills and court records, was simply staying. A daughter remained in her parents' house. She worked as she had always worked. She was fed and clothed and sheltered. And she received no wage, because wages were not part of the relationship. As her parents aged, she became their support, cooking, nursing, lifting, sitting up at night, and when they died the house and the land passed, in most customs, to a son, or to whichever heir the local practice dictated. And then she was in a room that belonged to her brother. This transition is one of the quiet hinges of the whole story. Medieval people knew it was coming, and the more careful among them made provision. Wills and land transfers include, over and over again, arrangements for exactly this. A father leaves the holding to his son on condition that the son maintain his sister, providing her with food, drink, clothing, fuel, and a specified place to live. Sometimes the terms are startlingly precise. So many bushels of grain a year. A named chamber in the house. The right to draw water from the well and to keep a hen. The right to sit by the fire. The right to a bed with its coverlet. A cow, or the milk of a cow. Access to a strip of the garden. Read a dozen of these and you understand something important. Nobody was leaving this to goodwill. The precision is the point. A verbal promise from a brother was worth very little once the brother had a wife of his own and children of his own, and a household with finite resources. A written condition attached to the inheritance could be enforced in the manor court, and it sometimes had to be. There are cases in the rolls where the maintenance was not provided, and the woman went to law about it. She stood before the court and stated that her brother owed her a measure of grain and had not delivered it, which tells us at once that these arrangements failed, and that women knew they had recourse when they did the same logic produced the retirement contracts made by aging people generally, a widow or an old couple surrendering land to an heir in exchange for lifetime maintenance, spelled out in the same painstaking detail. These documents are among the most humane things in the medieval archive, and also among the most unsentimental. They assume, quite openly, that families do not reliably look after their own without a written obligation. For the unmarried woman, then, the family home could be a refuge or a slow humiliation, depending entirely on the people in it and the terms she held. She might be genuinely beloved, the aunt who raised half the children in the house, who remembered every birth and every quarrel, whose hands did a third of the work. Or she might be tolerated, an extra mouth, a presence at the edge of a table where the food was counted. Both versions appear in wills, and the wills tell you which was which. A niece who has left the best brass pot, and the second best gown and the little chest was loved. A woman who has left nothing, and who appears only as a name in a maintenance clause, may not have been. Some women, of course, did not stay. They set up on their own, and this is where the picture gets genuinely interesting, because it happened more often than the old assumptions allowed. In towns particularly, unmarried women rented. They took a room, or a cellar, or a chamber above a shop, or a small cottage at the edge of a parish. Tax assessments and rent rolls show them, listed alone, paying small sums for small spaces. Sometimes several women appear at a single address, and the record does not explain the relationship, sisters, perhaps, or friends, or fellow workers, or simply people who could not afford a room alone and split one. That last arrangement deserves attention because it was a genuine solution to a genuine problem. Two women together could halve the rent, halve the fuel, share the cooking fire, divide the labour by skill. One spun while the other went to market. One had a trade, the other had the strength. It was a household in every practical sense except the legal one, and it made survival arithmetically possible where solitude did not. Historians have argued about how common these arrangements were and what they meant. The evidence is frustratingly thin, because ordinary cooperation between women produced almost no documents. Two sisters sharing a cottage for 30 years generate nothing for the archive unless one of them sues someone, brews too much ale, or writes a will. But the wills, when they come, are revealing. Women leave goods to the woman they lived with. They ask to be buried near her. They leave money for prayers for both their souls. The affection in these documents is unmistakable, and it was not, in its own time, considered strange. What she owned in that rented room can be reconstructed with unusual precision, because medieval people listed their goods when they died, and the lists survive. A bed, which usually meant the bedding rather than a frame, since the mattress and coverlet and sheets were the valuable part. Straw or chaff beneath, replaced when it grew foul. A coverlet, sometimes several, patched and repatched. A chest, which was the single most important piece of furniture in a poor household, serving as wardrobe, strongbox, table and seat all at once, and locked, with the key carried on a cord about the body. A brass or iron pot, which was expensive enough to be named individually in wills and passed down through generations. A trivet or a hook for the fire, wooden bowls and a spoon or two, perhaps a pewter dish if she had done well, a stool, a candlestick, shears, a spindle and distaff always, and her clothes, which were worth far more than we tend to assume. Cloth was expensive because making it was slow, and so garments were repaired, altered, turned, cut down, and passed on until they fell apart. A good gown was a form of savings, It could be pawned. It could be sold. It appears in wills as a bequest of real value. My best gown to my niece, my russet gown to my servant. The second-hand clothing trade was brisk everywhere, and was itself a common female occupation. Beneath the gown she wore a linen smock, which absorbed the wear and could be washed. Over it, an apron. On her head, a coif or a kerchief, because covered hair was expected of adult women, and to go uncovered in public was to make a statement. Around her waist, a girdle from which hung the things she needed. A knife, a purse, keys if she had anything worth locking. Keys are a small but resonant detail. To hold the keys of a household was to hold authority within it. A woman who kept the keys controlled the stores, the chest, the locked cupboard. And an unmarried woman living in her brother's house who was given the keys occupied a genuinely different position from one who was not. Food was plain and repetitive and structured by season and by fasting. Bread of whatever grain was affordable, wheat if she was fortunate, more often rye, barley, or a mixed grain. Pottage, the standing dish of medieval Europe, a thick soup of grain and vegetables and whatever else there was, simmering by the fire and topped up rather than finished. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, peas, cheese, which was the ordinary protein of poor households, eggs, salt fish, especially in Lent and on the many fast days the Church prescribed, which together accounted for a remarkable share of the year. Meat when it could be had, which for the poor meant rarely, and mostly bacon. And ale in quantity, because it was food as much as drink. She cooked over an open fire in a single pot. She had no oven. Baking was done communally or bought from a baker. She had no chimney. In many houses, only a hole in the roof through which the smoke found its way after filling the room. This is why medieval interiors were dark, why rafters were black, and why respiratory illness was so common. Fuel was the constant anxiety. Wood, turf, furs, dried dung, whatever the region provided. The right to gather fallen wood was a customary entitlement that people defended fiercely, and lords tried to limit, and the court rolls are full of fines for taking more than custom allowed. For a woman living alone with no man to cut and haul, fuel could be the difference between a winter survived and a winter endured. And she was watched. All the time. This is the thing to hold on to. A woman living alone in a medieval community was an anomaly, and anomalies attract explanation. Why is there no man? What does she live on? Who visits her, and at what hour? The absence of a household head was read as an absence of supervision, and the supervision was therefore supplied by the neighbourhood. Some of that scrutiny was benign and even protective. Neighbours noticed if her fire had not been lit. They noticed if she had not been seen for 2 days. They brought her things and expected things in return, and this reciprocity, a bowl of broth here, a bundle of kindling there, a night sitting with someone's sick child, was the informal welfare system on which everyone depended. It was more reliable than charity, and more immediate than the law, but the same watchfulness curdled easily. A woman living alone who had visitors was suspected. A woman living alone who prospered was suspected. A woman living alone who knew things, which herbs, which remedies, which words to say over a sick beast, was suspected in a way that could become dangerous when misfortune arrived and required a cause. We should be careful here, because the great witch persecutions belong to a later period than the one we are walking through tonight, and it is a mistake to project them backward across the whole Middle Ages. But belief in harmful magic existed throughout, and accusations of it appear in medieval church courts and manor courts, generally on a small and local scale, a quarrel, an accusation. A fine, a penance. The full machinery of persecution came later. The suspicion was already there, and so she banks her fire and bars her door, in a room she does not own, in a village that knows exactly how many hens she keeps. Outside, frost is settling on the thatch. A dog barks once, somewhere down the lane, and then stops. The night is very long. Sooner or later, in nearly every medieval community, somebody knocked on that door in the middle of the night. It might be a boy sent running from a house at the far end of the village, breathless, with a message half delivered. It might be a husband with a lantern who said nothing at all beyond a name. It might be a neighbour who simply stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she understood, and reached for her cloak. Because the woman living alone at the edge of things was very often the woman you went to get. This is one of the strangest and most persistent features of the unmarried woman's place in medieval society. She was marginal in the eyes of the law and suspect in the eyes of her neighbours, and at the same time she was frequently the person that community turned to at its most vulnerable moments: birth, illness, and death. Those three thresholds were women's territory in the Middle Ages, and the women who staffed them were disproportionately those without husbands and children of their own to keep them at home. Consider what medieval medicine actually looked like from the ground, because the textbooks give a misleading impression. Yes, there were physicians with university training in the theory of the humours, versed in Galen and in the Arabic authorities who had preserved and extended him. Yes, there were surgeons who set bones and lanced abscesses and stitched wounds, and apothecaries who compounded drugs. But these men were concentrated in cities, attended the wealthy, and charged accordingly. For the overwhelming majority of medieval people, in a village 3 hours' walk from anywhere, the person who came when you were ill was a local woman with a basket. Her knowledge was inherited and empirical, accumulated across a lifetime and passed from one woman to another without ever being written down in most cases. She knew which plants grew where and when to cut them. Willow bark for pain, though she could not have said why it worked. Honey on wounds, which does in fact help. Comfrey on bruises and swellings. Yarrow to slow bleeding. Chamomile, mint, sage, fennel, rue, tansy, betony, poultices of bread or bran or linseed. Steam for a tight chest. Broth, warmth, and above all the patient presence of someone sitting up through the night, watching whether the breathing changed. Some of what she did helped, some of it did nothing but comfort, which is not nothing, and some of it was actively harmful, because the pharmacopoeia included things that would poison as readily as cure, and because bleeding and purging were applied enthusiastically at every level of medicine to people who badly needed neither. Alongside the herbs ran the charms, and this is where modern readers often want a clean separation that the medieval world did not provide. She might apply a poultice and say words over it. She might tie a red thread about a child's wrist. She might write a prayer on a scrap of parchment and fold it small and hang it around a neck. She might use words that were plainly Christian, the opening of a gospel, a prayer to a saint associated with the ailment, and she might use words that were older than anyone remembered and made no sense to anybody, transmitted by sound alone across generations. The church condemned a good deal of this, and preachers thundered about it, and penitential manuals listed it among the sins to be confessed. And it went on regardless in every parish, frequently practised by people who were also perfectly devout and saw no contradiction whatever. Whether the woman doing it believed the words carried power, or simply did what had always been done because doing nothing was unbearable, is not a question the sources will answer. Historians continue to argue about it, and the honest answer is that both were probably true, in different women on different nights. Then there was childbirth, which was the great female event of medieval life, and the one from which men were most thoroughly excluded. Birth happened at home, in a darkened, warmed room, attended by women. The mother's neighbours and kin gathered, the gossips, in the original sense of the word, meaning the women who attended a birth and stood as godparents afterwards. The room was prepared, shutters closed, fire built up, water heated, linen made ready. And at the centre of it stood the midwife. She was not licensed in the way later midwives would be, though in some places bishops began to require an oath, and the oath is revealing. It bound her to honest practice, to avoid harmful means, to not conceal a child's true parentage, and, most importantly, to baptize a newborn in danger of death. That last duty gave the midwife a spiritual authority almost unique among medieval laywomen. If a child was dying, there was no time to fetch a priest. She was to pour water and speak the words herself, and that baptism was valid. In a world where the fate of an unbaptized soul was a source of genuine anguish, she stood in the priest's place at the most desperate moment a family could face. A midwife could, in that instant, do what no other woman was permitted to do. Her skill was practical and hard-won. She judged the progress of a labour by touch and by long familiarity. She knew certain interventions for a badly positioned child. She managed the cord, cleaned and swaddled the infant, watched for bleeding, and stayed. Afterwards she returned, sometimes for days, and she presided over the customs surrounding the mother's recovery and eventual return to church. And she was surrounded by belief, layered thick. Knots were untied and doors and cupboards left unlatched, on the principle that binding in the house meant binding in the body. Girdles associated with saints were borrowed from churches and wrapped around labouring women. Prayers were pinned to bed curtains. Relics were sent for. In a situation of extreme danger with almost no effective medical recourse, people reached for every form of help that existed, and the boundary between prayer and charm blurred until it disappeared. Because the danger was real. Childbirth killed women, and it killed infants at rates that are difficult to sit with. Everyone in that room had seen it happen. The midwife had seen it many times. An unmarried midwife had one advantage over her married colleagues, and it is a bleak sort of advantage. She could go. A woman with 6 children of her own could not always walk 4 miles at midnight in February. A woman with no household waiting could. And so the summons came to her, again and again, until her name was known across several parishes and messengers arrived from villages she had never lived in. She walked those roads with a lantern of horn, carrying linen and thread and shears and oil, and perhaps a little wine or spirits. Frozen ruts turned an ankle. Rain turned the lane to a river of mud. A boy went ahead of her with a torch, and at the end of it, a room full of frightened women and a life balanced on what she could do with her hands. Payment came in whatever form was available. Coins, when there were coins. More often eggs, cheese, a fowl, grain, cloth, a promise of labour at harvest. Sometimes nothing, because the family had nothing, and she went anyway, and the debt was remembered in the informal ledger that villagers kept in their heads. Which brings us to the third threshold, and the one that unmarried women attended most consistently of all. Death in the medieval world was public, communal, and female at the point of contact. When someone was dying, the household filled. Prayers were said. A priest came if he could to hear the last confession and administer the final rites, which mattered enormously. A good death was one for which you were prepared, surrounded by people, absolved. Sudden death was feared not primarily because it was sudden, but because it came without warning and left the soul unready. And when it was over, women took the body. They washed it. They closed the eyes and bound the jaw. They laid it out and wrapped it in a linen shroud, sometimes a length of cloth kept for years for exactly that purpose. They set candles about it and watched beside it through the night, and the watching was a social occasion of a strange kind, with neighbours coming and going, prayers said, food shared, stories told about the dead. The women who did this work were paid a little when there was money and thanked when there was not. And it was, in every village, a small number of women who did it, the ones who were not squeamish, who were reliable, who did not need to hurry home. The unmarried woman was very often one of them. She therefore stood at both ends of every life in her community. She saw them into the world and she washed them out of it. She knew who had died hard and who had died easy, who had confessed and who had not, which families had grieved and which had merely arranged the funeral. She carried in her head the intimate history of everyone around her, and this is precisely why she was feared. Knowledge of that kind sits uneasily in a small community. She had been present at the worst moments of her neighbours' lives. She had seen them without their dignity. She knew things, and because she had no husband whose standing could shelter her, and no children whose futures gave her hostages to the community's good opinion, there was nothing to soften the unease. So when a cow died without explanation, when butter refused to come, when a child sickened with fits that no one could account for, the mind of the village had somewhere to go. Not always, not even often, but sometimes. The medieval response to this was more restrained than what came later. Church courts handled most accusations of harmful magic as matters of superstition or defamation, rather than as capital crimes. A woman accused might be made to do public penance, walking barefoot in procession with a candle. Her accuser might be fined for slander if the accusation could not be sustained. The elaborate demonological apparatus that turned scattered village suspicion into organised persecution belongs to a later age. But the raw material was there, and it was there in the shape of exactly the women we have been following. Old, alone, poor, knowledgeable, and useful, right up until the moment they became frightening. She might be both in the same week. One household sent for her remedy on Monday, and another whispered about her on Friday. She held the position that unmarried women so often held in medieval life, indispensable and unsettling at once, needed at the threshold, and mistrusted at the hearth. The lantern comes back down the lane long after midnight. Her cloak smells of smoke and rain and crushed herbs. She sets the basket by the door, rakes the ash from the embers, and washes her hands in cold water from the pail. Somewhere behind her, in a house she has just left, a child is breathing. Or is not. There is a moment in almost every one of these lives when the arithmetic changes. It rarely announced itself. There was no birthday that marked it, no ceremony, no line in a register. It happened in the body, gradually and then suddenly. One winter the cold got into her hands and stayed there. One spring she noticed that the thread kept breaking because she could no longer see it properly by rushlight. One market day the basket that she had carried for 30 years felt wrong on the walk home, and she had to set it down twice. Age arrived early in the Middle Ages, and it arrived hardest for the people who had worked hardest. A woman who had carried water and lifted wet linen and stooped over a spindle since she was 12 did not have the joints of a woman who had not. Teeth went, eyes went, backs went. And for a woman whose entire survival rested on the sale of her own labour, the failure of the body was not simply a discomfort. It was the removal of her income. This is the great vulnerability of the unmarried life, and everyone in the medieval world understood it perfectly well. Marriage and children were, among many other things, an old age pension. You raised sons and daughters, you handed them the holding, and in exchange they kept you. That was the bargain. The maintenance contracts we looked at earlier are simply that bargain written down, because people knew it could not be relied upon otherwise. A woman without children had no such claim on anyone. What she had instead were 4 things: kin, savings, community, and charity. And she used all of them. Kin first. The unmarried aunt, the maiden sister. These figures are everywhere in medieval family arrangements, and their position was almost always contingent. She lived in a brother's house, or a nephew's, or with a married sister. She earned her keep, and she earned it late into life, long past the point where anyone would now consider her fit for work. She minded children. She sat with the sick. She spun. She kept the fire. She was useful, and her usefulness was, in a real sense, her rent. The danger came when the usefulness ran out. An old woman who could no longer contribute became a burden in a household with finite grain, and medieval households ran close enough to the edge that this was not merely a matter of sentiment. Wills sometimes show us families making genuine provision for such women. Court cases sometimes show us families failing to. Both are the truth. Savings next, and here the evidence is more cheering than one might expect. Unmarried women saved, deliberately and over long periods, and they saved in forms that could be converted. Coins, hidden in the chest or beneath the floor or sewn into clothing. Pewter, which held its value. A brass pot, bedding silver spoons in the more comfortable households which functioned almost as currency. Cloth, and above all, they made loans. This is one of the genuinely surprising things the court records reveal. Single women in medieval towns and villages appear repeatedly as creditors. They lent small sums to neighbours and expected repayment. They sold goods on credit. They stood as pledges. And when repayment failed, they sued, which is how we know about it at all. Because a loan that is repaid leaves no trace, and a loan that is not ends up in a court roll. A woman with money out on loan around her parish had built herself something like a pension. It was fragile, dependent on the solvency and honesty of her debtors, and vulnerable to a bad harvest that ruined everybody at once. But it was hers, made by her, in her own name, and it required no husband's permission. Then community. The informal economy of favour and obligation that we have touched on throughout tonight's story mattered most at the end of a life. The woman who had sat up with sick children for 40 years had a very large number of people who owed her something, and villagers remembered. Broth appeared at her door. Somebody's son cut her fuel. Somebody's daughter fetched her water. The neighbour across the lane looked to see whether her smoke was rising in the morning. This was not sentimentality. It was reciprocity operating over decades, and it was the most effective form of old age provision that most poor people had. It is also, almost by definition, invisible in the archive. A bowl of pottage carried across a lane generates no document. And finally, charity, which was the medieval world's formal answer to poverty, and which was, at the same time, thoroughly entangled with theology. Almsgiving was not optional in medieval Christianity. It was a work of mercy, one of the ways a sinner might reduce the burden of purgatory, and it was therefore in everyone's spiritual interest to give. The consequence, which is worth stating plainly, is that the medieval poor were not merely objects of pity. They were spiritually useful. A poor person who received alms was expected to pray for the soul of the giver, and those prayers were considered efficacious. The transaction ran in both directions. This shaped everything about how relief was organised. Wealthy people left money in their wills for distributions of bread, ale, clothing, coal and pennies, often on the anniversary of their death, often at their funeral, often with an explicit instruction that the recipients pray for them. Parish funds accumulated small bequests. Guilds and fraternities, which were among the most important social institutions of the later Middle Ages, maintained their members and their widows, and sometimes their unmarried women, and buried them decently, and prayed for them afterwards. Women joined these fraternities in considerable numbers, including unmarried women, paying their subscriptions year after year toward exactly the moment when they would need what the fraternity provided. It was, in effect, a burial club and a mutual aid society with a religious frame around it, and for a woman with no children, it was one of the few ways to guarantee that someone would see her into the ground properly. Because that mattered enormously. To die unburied, unremembered, with no one to pray for your soul, was a genuine terror. It is why so many wills of poor women contain small sums for candles, for a priest to say masses, for a name to be entered on a bead roll and read aloud in church. To be named in church after death was to be kept in the community's memory in the most literal sense. A woman with no descendants bought her remembrance with what she had. Then there were the almshouses, and the hospitals that functioned as almshouses, and here we find some of the clearest evidence of unmarried women's later lives. Founders endowed institutions to house a fixed number of poor people, and the statutes survive, and they are precise about who might be admitted. Often it was widows. Often it was people of the founder's own town or parish. Often the requirements included good character, church attendance, and freedom from drunkenness and quarrelling. Residents received a room, a small allowance of bread or coal or money, sometimes a garden plot, sometimes a distinctive gown that marked them out in the street as the beneficiaries of that particular founder's generosity. The gown was warmth, and it was advertisement. It kept the founder's name alive every time the wearer walked to church. Life in such a place was regulated. Attendance at prayer was compulsory, and the prayers were frequently specified for the founder, for the founder's family, for the souls of the dead. Rules governed visitors, hours, cleanliness, conduct. Expulsion was possible for infraction, and it was, for all that, an immense relief compared to the alternative, which was a cold room and an empty hearth and the slow arithmetic of a winter with insufficient fuel. Some historians describe this system as merciful. Others describe it as controlling, a mechanism by which the poor were disciplined in exchange for survival and their gratitude made visible. It was plainly both, and the woman receiving the coal was in no position to fret over which. For those who had none of it, no kin, no savings, no fraternity, no almshouse place, there was begging. And medieval attitudes toward beggars were more complicated than the later centuries' hard distinctions. A beggar was, in one light, Christ in disguise. The poor at the gate were an opportunity for grace. In another light, especially after labour became scarce and wages rose, the able-bodied beggar was a shirker to be driven off. The old, the sick, the crippled, and the elderly woman with visibly ruined hands fell on the acceptable side of that line, and could seek alms at a door or a church porch or a monastery gate without shame. Monastic almsgiving was a daily reality in many places. Bread and broth distributed at the gate, leftovers from the refectory, a dole on particular feast days. A woman might make a slow circuit of such places, and know which house gave on which day, and time her walking accordingly. Winter is where all of this was tested. The fuel had to last. The grain had to last. The days were 4 or 5 hours of usable light, and the nights were endless, and cold in a house with a hole in the roof for a chimney is a thing that gets into the bones and does not leave. She kept the fire small because she had to. She wore everything she owned, layered. She went to bed early because bed was warmer than sitting up, and because burning light for no purpose was waste. She rationed, and she was alone with a great deal of time. What did she think about in those long dark hours? We can only guess, but the objects suggest something. Women kept things. A ribbon, a single glove, a paternoster, the string of beads told through in prayer, worn smooth by decades of handling. A letter, if she could read or knew someone who would read it to her. A cross, a pilgrim badge from a shrine visited once 40 years ago in a summer she still remembered. These were not decorations, they were anchors, physical objects holding memories that had no other place to live, because a woman with no children had no one to tell them to. And this, quietly, is where the unmarried woman found her last and perhaps most important role. She became the one who remembered. She knew which family had held which strips of land before the dispute. She knew who was related to whom 3 generations back, and why those 2 households did not speak. She knew where the old path had run before the hedge was moved. She knew the customs of the manor because she had heard them recited when she was a child by people who were already old. And in a world where custom was law, where the answer to a legal question was frequently what has always been done here, that memory had real weight. Manorial inquests called upon the oldest inhabitants to testify to what the custom had been. Boundary disputes were settled by the recollection of those who had walked the bounds longest. Old women were not consulted for sentiment. They were consulted because they were the archive. The young laughed at her stories, no doubt, as the young generally do, and then came back when they needed to know something. The fire is low. The wind moves across the roof and finds the gaps in the thatch, as it always has. She sits with the beads running through fingers that no longer straighten fully, and outside the frost is hardening on the ridge and furrow of a field that will still be there long after she is not. And yet none of these women lived in isolation, however much the word alone haunts the records that describe them. That word is a trap, and it is worth pausing on before we come to the end of our journey tonight, because it has done more to distort our picture of unmarried medieval women than almost anything else. When a tax assessor wrote a woman's name with no husband beside it, he was recording a legal condition, not a social one. When a clerk noted a woman dwelling alone, he meant that no man headed her household. He did not mean that she passed her days in silence. The truth is that a medieval village or town street offered almost no opportunity for solitude at all, and the woman who genuinely wanted it would have had to work very hard indeed to find it. Her life was conducted in the open, at the well, in the churchyard, in the fields at harvest, in the shared oven, at the mill, on the road to market. Every one of those places was a meeting point, and every one of them ran on conversation. Consider the well, or the stream, or whatever the local source of water happened to be. Water was heavy, and it was needed constantly, and it could not be stored in quantity, which meant that fetching it was a daily journey made by women, repeatedly, at predictable hours. And so the water source became a kind of institution, the place where news arrived and was distributed, where a birth was announced, where a death was confirmed, where a stranger seen on the road was described and speculated about, where the price of grain was discussed and complaints about the miller were rehearsed for the 100th time. The same was true of the communal oven, in places that had one, and of the mill, where you waited your turn and were cheated by the miller and discussed the fact loudly. The same was true of the churchyard after Mass, which in most communities functioned rather more as a village green than a solemn space, and where business was transacted, agreements struck, and quarrels renewed. For an unmarried woman, these were not merely social occasions, they were her infrastructure. This was where she heard that a household needed a spinner, that a farmer was hiring for the hay, that a woman 2 lanes over had a fever and might pay for nursing. Work reached her by word of mouth, and word of mouth required presence. It was also where her reputation lived, and was made, and could be destroyed. We touched earlier on defamation, but it deserves fuller attention here, because it reveals something that the older histories of medieval women got badly wrong. Women were not passive recipients of gossip. They were participants in it, as sources, as transmitters, and as litigants. Church court records show large numbers of women suing over words spoken against them, and the words most often at issue were sexual. To bring such a case was to stand up in a public forum and demand that the community formally retract what it had said. And they won, often. The offender might be ordered to make a public apology, to walk in procession, to say before witnesses that she had spoken falsely. A woman's name, once cleared in that manner, was cleared in front of everyone who mattered. That is not the behaviour of women without agency. It is the behaviour of women who understood exactly what reputation was worth and were prepared to spend money defending it. But the same networks that could destroy a woman could sustain her, and the sustaining is harder to see because it left almost nothing behind. Think about what women exchanged, constantly, without record. Fire when a hearth went cold, yeast or balm from a brewing, passed from house to house so that bread could be raised. Seeds from a good crop, the loan of a pot, a pan, a pair of shears, the loan of a hand at a moment when 2 hands were not enough, lifting a beam, hauling a sick animal, holding a child still while a wound was cleaned. Advice about a rash, a cough, a difficult pregnancy. A meal carried across a lane during illness. Someone to watch the children for an hour so a woman could go to market. Every one of these was an obligation created, and, sooner or later, discharged. Nobody wrote them down. Everybody remembered them. An unmarried woman was deeply embedded in this system, and often more deeply than a married one, because she had the flexibility that married women with infants did not. She could go and sit with the dying, she could take in a niece for a season, she could be lent to a household in crisis. Her time was, in a certain sense, communal property, and this cut both ways. It meant she was valued. It also meant that people felt entitled to her, and that her own needs were assumed to be smaller because she had no husband and no children. Godparenthood formalized some of these bonds. To stand as godmother at a baptism was to enter a recognized relationship with the child and with its parents, one the Church took seriously enough to treat as a genuine kinship for certain purposes. A godmother gave a small gift, a spoon, a coin, a cap, and thereafter had a claim on the family, and they on her. An unmarried woman with a dozen godchildren scattered across a parish had constructed something remarkably like a family, and the medieval world recognized it as such. Then there were the friendships, which the sources give us only in glimpses, and which are all the more affecting for that. Wills are the best witness. A woman leaves her best gown to a woman with no stated relationship to her. She leaves her bed and its coverlet to the woman she has lived with these many years. She asks to be buried beside her. She leaves money for masses to be said for both their souls together. She names her as executor, which was an act of real trust, since an executor handled the money, settled the debts, and answered for the estate. Read enough of these and a picture assembles itself of long, deep, ordinary companionships between women that lasted decades and left no other trace. Two sisters who never married and kept a house together for 40 years. Two servants who met in one household at 17 and were still in each other's lives at 60. A woman and the neighbour who had attended her mother's death and her own long illness. Historians have debated at length what these relationships were, and the honest answer is that the sources rarely permit certainty, and that the categories we would reach for now did not exist in the same form then. What is not in doubt is the affection, or its durability, or the fact that medieval society accommodated it without apparent difficulty. Two women sharing a household attracted no particular comment. It was practical. It was ordinary. It was, for a great many women, simply how life was arranged. There were also the fraternities and guilds which we met briefly, and which offered a formal version of the same thing. Women joined religious guilds in large numbers. They paid their dues, attended the annual feast, processed with candles on the guild's saint's day, and in return the guild undertook to support members who fell into poverty, to visit them in sickness, to bury them, and to pray for their souls in perpetuity. For a woman with no children to remember her, that last promise was worth every penny of the subscription. And then there was the parish itself, which was the true centre of medieval community life, in a way that is difficult to convey now. The church was not merely where you worshipped, it was the largest building you had access to, the place where you were named, married if you married, and buried. Its calendar organised the year. Its feasts were your holidays. Its ales and gatherings raised money and provided the nearest thing to public entertainment. Its bells told you the time, warned you of fire, called you to gather, and announced who had died. Women were central to the life of the parish, and unmarried women particularly so. They cleaned, they laundered the altar linen, they provided candles and wax, they organised and cooked for the parish ales, they joined the maidens' groups that existed in many parishes, associations of unmarried young women who raised money for the church, maintained a particular light before a particular image, and appear in churchwardens' accounts contributing sums that were far from trivial. Those accounts are a small revelation. Line after line, year after year, received from the maidens so many shillings. It is one of the very few places in the medieval archive where unmarried women appear as an organised collective with a treasury and a purpose, acting together, in public, and being formally recorded doing it. They lit candles. That is what a great deal of the money went toward. Before an image of the Virgin or a local saint, a light was to be kept burning, and keeping it burning cost money, and the maidens of the parish raised it. There is something almost unbearably apt in that as an image for tonight, a group of women whose names are mostly gone, whose lives left almost no documents, remembered in an account book only because they kept a light burning in a building that in many cases is still standing. And in the end, that is the shape of what survives. Not biographies, not portraits, not the interior life. What survives are the traces left by women who are doing something else entirely, paying a fine, suing a debtor, defending a name, making a will, raising money for a candle, being buried. The medieval archive records them only when they collided with an institution that wrote things down, which is why the temptation to conclude that their lives were empty must be resisted so firmly. Emptiness is not what the sources show. What the sources show is a documentary silence, and documentary silence is a property of the record, not of the life. The woman who spun for 50 years and died in a rented room with a chest, a pot, 2 gowns and a set of beads was not living an empty life. She was living a life whose contents, The friendships, the godchildren, the nights sitting up with other people's dying parents, the knowledge in her hands, the reciprocal debts that ran in every direction down her lane, happened to be of a kind that no clerk had any reason to write down. Evening comes down over the parish. The Angelus rings, and across the fields people straighten from their work and cross themselves, more from habit than from thought. In the church, a small flame stands steady in its holder before a painted image, paid for by a group of young women who will be old within the span of a single generation. The door of the church is pulled shut. The lane empties, and in a dozen small houses, women who never married cover their fires for the night. So what remains of her? Not very much, if we measure by the things history usually keeps. There is no tomb with her effigy carved in alabaster, hands folded, a small dog at her feet. There is no chronicle entry recording her opinions. There is no portrait, because portraits were for people whose faces someone had a reason to preserve. Almost every unmarried woman who lived in medieval Europe has vanished so completely that not even her name survives, and the ones whose names do survive are usually attached to nothing else. A line in a rental, a burial entry, a fine of 2p for brewing against the assize. And yet things do remain, and they are worth naming one by one, slowly, as the fire burns down. A pot. Brass or bronze, 3-legged, blackened, mended at least once, named specifically in a will because it was valuable enough to be worth naming. Such pots survive in museums, and they have been dug out of the ground in their hundreds, and there is no way of knowing which of them stood on the hearth of a woman who never married. But some of them did a spindle haul. A small weight of stone or lead or bone with a hole through the middle, and they turn up everywhere, in ploughed fields and building sites and riverbanks, because they were dropped constantly and were too cheap to look for. Every one of them was fitted to a stick and spun by somebody's fingers, and the great majority of those fingers were female, and a very great many of them belonged to women who spun for a living because they had no husband earning. A key. Iron, worn at the shoulders where it was gripped, hanging from a cord at the waist. A set of beads, told through so many times that the surfaces have gone smooth and slightly asymmetrical. A chest with an old lock. A name in a churchwarden's account, among the maidens who gave toward the light. A line in a will, to my sister, dwelling with me, my best gown and the bed I lie in, and 40p. A stitched initial in the corner of a piece of linen. And, in a great many parishes, the building itself, the church where she was baptized and buried, whose stones she walked past 10,000 times, whose bell measured out every day of her life and rang for her at the end of it. These are small things. They are also, when you set them side by side, the physical residue of an entire way of living, and the fact that we can hold them is not nothing. But I want to end tonight, not with objects, but with a correction. Because we have been walking for many hours now through a story that has usually been told badly, and it deserves better. The old version goes something like this. Medieval women married young, married always, and existed as wives and mothers and nothing else, and the ones who failed to marry were tragic remainders, pitied and mocked, waiting out their lives at the edge of somebody else's fire. Almost every part of that is wrong, or at least much too simple. Women in much of northwestern Europe did not necessarily marry young. Many married in their 20s after a decade of wage-earning service and made their own choices about whom to marry more often than we once assumed. A substantial proportion. Historians argue about the figure, and the figure varied enormously by region and period and the aftermath of plague, but a substantial proportion never married at all. And those women were not sitting idle. They were brewing the ale that a whole village drank. They were spinning the thread on which the largest industry in Europe rested. They were selling fish and butter and eggs in the market. They were running shops and extending credit and suing debtors. They were governing abbeys with estates in 3 counties. They were living in beginnages in the middle of prosperous cities, working and praying and answering to no husband. They were delivering babies and baptizing the dying ones. They were washing the dead. They were teaching the daughters of local families to read. They were, in a handful of extraordinary cases, writing books that we still read. Were they mocked? Sometimes, certainly. The literature of the period is not kind to old women, and the Alewife became a comic grotesque in verse and wall painting. And there was a persistent unease about women who lived outside male authority that would harden, in the centuries after our story, into something far worse. Were they pitied? Sometimes. And sometimes they were feared, and sometimes deferred to, and sometimes simply relied upon so completely that nobody thought to remark on it at all. The word we have inherited for them tells the whole story in miniature. Spinster began as a job. It described a woman making thread useful, skilled, essential, everywhere. Only later did it slide across to mean a woman without a husband. And later still did it acquire the little curl of contempt it carries now. The journey of that single word, from occupation to condition to insult, is the journey of how these women were gradually reduced in the imagination of the centuries that followed them. We might, tonight, hand the word back its original meaning. She spun, that is what she did, she spun. And she brewed, and she carried, and she sat up through nights that other people were spared, and she kept a light burning in a church that is still standing. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is the thing that I suspect matters most. We should not assume we know how she felt about any of it. That is the temptation, and it is almost irresistible. We look at a life without marriage and without children in a world that expected both, and we fill in the emotion ourselves: loneliness, regret, resignation, the ache of the road not taken. And for some women that is surely exactly right. There were women who wanted marriage badly and did not get it, whose intended died of a fever in a bad autumn, whose portion was spent on a lawsuit, whose name was destroyed by a rumour that had no substance. There were women who watched younger sisters marry and leave, and who felt every departure like a small door closing. But there were also women who had seen enough of marriage to want none of it, who had watched a mother die in childbed, or an aunt worn to nothing by 12 pregnancies, or a neighbour beaten in a house from which the law offered very little escape, who looked at the arrangement on offer and quietly declined it, who found that a rented room, a trade, a friend to share the rent with, and the right to sign their own name on a document was, all things considered, the better bargain. And there were probably a great many women who felt both things at different hours of the same day for 50 years, which is how human beings usually manage their lives, and there is no reason to think medieval people were any different. What we can say with confidence is that the absence of a husband was not the absence of a life. It was the absence of one particular institution, and around that absence a life assembled itself anyway, out of work and friendship and obligation and habit and faith, the way water finds a course down a hillside, whether or not anyone has dug a channel for it. Their story is not a story of what was missing. It is a story of what was built instead. And so, as the night deepens, let us leave them where we found them. The village is quiet now. The last cart came down the lane hours ago, and the ruts have begun to stiffen with frost. Smoke rises thin and straight from a dozen roofs, because the wind has finally dropped. In the fields the ridge and furrow lie in long dark bands under a sky that is beginning to clear. In one house, 2 sisters who never married have finished a plain supper and are sitting on either side of a low fire, saying very little, because after 40 years there is not a great deal that needs saying. In another, an old woman turns a string of beads through fingers that no longer straighten, and remembers a summer she has not thought about in years. Somewhere out on the road, a woman with a lantern is walking toward a house where a child is being born, and she will be there before midnight. And in the church, in the dark, a single candle stands burning before a painted image, paid for by the young women of the parish out of money they raised themselves, and it will burn until it gutters, and someone comes to light another. The bell in the tower is silent now, It has rung across these fields for longer than anyone living can remember, and it will go on ringing long after every person who heard it tonight has gone. Generations arrive, live their brief seasons, and pass on like leaves carried off in autumn wind. The women of this story have gone back into that quiet landscape. They stand in old doorways and walk paths that no longer exist, and sleep beneath the same stars that watch them work. Their voices are faint. They are not entirely lost. A pot. A haul of lead. A name in an account book. A gown left to a niece. A candle. These are the embers that remain after a very great fire has burned low, and now the fire in your own room is low too, and the hour is late, and the medieval world is receding into the distance the way it always does, the candles shortening, the halls going still, the roads emptying, the fields sleeping beneath the stars. Only the gentle rhythm of time remains. Thank you for spending this night with me, and with them. If this journey helped you rest, do let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and what the hour was where you are. I read every one. And if you would like more of these long, quiet walks through the past, subscribing tells me which centuries to visit next. Sleep well, history lovers. The bells will ring again in the morning.